Many Tudor rivalries were won without a single sword ever leaving its sheath. In the royal court, women who held no official power still managed to reshape reputations, alliances, and even the king's trust through patience, rumor, and carefully chosen silence. A smile could hide a strategy, a quiet conversation could begin a downfall, and a disappearance could happen without anyone daring to name the cause. Tonight, we step into the elegant halls of the Tudor court to uncover how these invisible battles quietly decided who remained near power and who vanished from it forever. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone had stood quietly in the galleries of the Tudor court and simply watched for an afternoon, the first thing they might have noticed was not authority, but distance. The king rarely shouted orders across rooms. He rarely raised his voice at all. Instead, power seemed to move through the spaces around him like a slow current, carried by proximity, glances, and the quiet privilege of standing just a little closer than everyone else. The Tudor court was a place built on ceremony. Doors opened in careful order. Courtiers bowed at precise angles. Servants moved through corridors, with trays held steady at chest height. Their footsteps softened by worn stone and woven carpets. Everything appeared controlled, almost peaceful. Yet beneath that controlled surface was a constant tension that never truly faded. The court was not merely a residence. It was the centre of political gravity in England. Every noble family wanted someone there. Every alliance depended on it. The distance between a person and the king could quietly determine their future, their wealth, and sometimes even their survival. Men competed openly for influence. They sought offices, titles, and land. Their rivalries were written in documents and debated in council chambers. But another form of competition unfolded more quietly in the same corridors, one that rarely appeared in official records. Women at court did not possess formal authority. They could not sit in the king's council or command armies. Their names rarely appeared in laws or treaties. Yet, they lived closer to the daily rhythms of royal life than many powerful men. They attended dinners. They stood beside the queens. They walked in gardens where conversations were softer and less guarded. In these quiet moments, influence could take root. Proximity mattered in ways that outsiders often failed to understand. A woman who shared a few private minutes with the king could shape his mood before a council meeting. A quiet remark at the right moment could soften anger, strengthen suspicion, or plant an idea that seemed to belong to him. This kind of influence left almost no trace. It was rarely written down. It did not require signatures or seals. It moved through tone, timing, and memory. For many women at court, this closeness was the only form of power available. The Tudor world was intensely observant. People watched one another constantly. Servants noticed who entered certain rooms. Ladies at court noticed who was invited to ride in the royal gardens. Courtiers noticed who lingered near the king after supper. Nothing was ever entirely private. A single evening conversation could travel through the palace by morning. A look exchanged across a table might become speculation before the candles burned out. In such an environment, presence itself became a kind of currency. Being near the king meant being visible. Being visible meant being discussed. And discussion, in the Tudor court, could quickly turn into influence. This reality shaped the lives of the king's companions in particular. The women who gained the king's affection were not merely romantic figures. They became focal points in a delicate system of attention and rivalry. Their presence could attract alliances. Their absence could rearrange loyalties. Yet their position was never secure. A mistress did not possess the legal protection of a wife. She held no formal title tied to her relationship with the king. Her importance depended almost entirely on his favour and on how others interpreted that favour. In theory, the king's attention could be given freely and withdrawn just as easily. In practice, the situation was more complicated. Courtiers quickly learned that the woman closest to the king often influenced the atmosphere around him. If she encouraged certain visitors, they found doors opening more easily. If she regarded someone with suspicion, whispers could begin before that person realized what had changed. Such influence was subtle but powerful. It did not require public declarations. It did not require official authority. It simply required access. And access, in the Tudor court, was never equally distributed. A woman who spent evenings in the king's company became a figure everyone watched. Some watched with admiration. Others watched with calculation. Families might see opportunity in her presence. Rival women might see danger. Because proximity to the king did not only bring attention, it brought competition. This competition rarely took the form of loud confrontation. The court valued politeness, and public scandal could damage everyone involved. Direct accusations were risky. Open hostility could quickly backfire. So rivalry took quieter forms. A woman might arrive at a gathering with a carefully chosen story that casts doubt on another's reputation. She might praise someone else in a way that suggested comparison. She might simply position herself beside the king at the right moment, allowing silence to communicate what words did not. These gestures appeared small, yet over time, they could shape how people perceived one another. The Tudor court functioned as a landscape of observation. Everyone watched for changes in the king's attention. Everyone interpreted small signals as evidence of shifting power. The way he greeted someone, the length of a conversation, whether he smiled, these details mattered more than formal announcements. For women navigating this world, awareness became essential. They needed to understand who supported whom, which alliances existed between noble families, and how rumours travelled through the palace. Mistakes could spread quickly. A careless remark might become a story repeated across the court. An awkward moment could be remembered long after the original cause had been forgotten. Reputation, once damaged, rarely recovers easily. Because of this, the women closest to the king lived under constant scrutiny. Their clothing was noticed. Their expressions were discussed. Even their silences could attract interpretation. Yet within this scrutiny, influence quietly grew. A woman who understood the rhythms of the court could learn when to speak and when to remain quiet. She could learn which conversations mattered and which ones simply filled the air. Over time, these small decisions accumulated. Influence rarely appeared suddenly. It gathered slowly, like dust settling across polished surfaces. The king might never announce that he trusted someone's judgment. He might never publicly acknowledge her role in shaping his opinions. But those who spent time in the palace often understood the reality long before any document confirmed it. The Tudor court looked orderly from a distance. Music played during feasts. Banners hung from walls. Diplomats arrived and departed under carefully arranged ceremonies. Yet inside that orderly world, attention itself had become a battlefield. No swords were drawn. No armies marched through the corridors. But the struggle for proximity never truly stopped. For some women, that proximity became the closest thing to power they would ever hold. And for others, it became something worth fighting for in ways the official histories rarely describe. The Tudor court was not only a place of ceremony, but a landscape where closeness quietly determined influence. Women without titles discovered that standing near the king could matter more than possessing formal authority, and once proximity began to resemble power, rivalry among those who shared it became impossible to avoid. The position of a Tudor mistress appeared glamorous from a distance, but inside the walls of the royal court, it rested on ground that could shift at any moment. There were no documents declaring her place, no laws protecting her presence. and no ceremonies confirming her importance. Her influence depended entirely on something fragile and unpredictable: the king's affection. At first glance, the role might have seemed enviable. A woman favoured by the king could receive gifts, attention, and the subtle admiration of courtiers who understood what proximity to power could mean. Jewels appeared. Private conversations became possible. Doors that remained closed to others sometimes opened without explanation. Yet none of this belonged to her in any permanent way. Unlike a queen, a mistress possessed no official title linked to the relationship. The queen stood within a structure built by church, law, and ceremony. Her marriage was recorded, witnessed, and recognized by the kingdom. Even when queens fell from favor, their position existed in the language of politics and religion. A mistress lived outside that structure entirely. She occupied a place that everyone could see, yet no one formally acknowledged. Her presence at court might be obvious, discussed in corridors and whispered about in chambers, but it remained unofficial. This ambiguity gave her a certain freedom, but it also made her dangerously exposed. Because what the king gave privately, he could withdraw privately as well. There were no negotiations when affection cooled. No councils were debating whether a mistress should remain near the court. A change in the king's attention could quietly rearrange everything. A woman who had been greeted warmly one month might find herself ignored the next, in a place as observant as the Tudor court. These shifts were noticed immediately. Courtiers watched the king's habits closely. They noticed who he spoke to after dinner, who joined him in the gardens, and who was suddenly absent from gatherings where she once appeared regularly. Attention was measured carefully. If the king paused to listen to someone longer than usual, people remembered. If he stopped inviting a woman to certain events, they noticed that as well. For a mistress, this constant observation created an atmosphere of uncertainty that rarely disappeared. Every conversation carried weight. Every appearance in public could strengthen or weaken the impression surrounding her. Maintaining favour required careful awareness of the court's rhythms. A mistress needed to understand who might resent her influence, which families might see opportunity in her presence, and which courtiers might quietly hope for her downfall. Because admiration at court often arrived with hidden calculations, some people treated the king's companion with politeness, not out of respect, but because they believed her position might help them later. Others remained friendly while waiting patiently for the moment her influence began to fade. Patience was common in royal courts. A rival did not need to confront her openly. Time alone could change the balance of attention. The king himself was not always consistent in his interests. Tudor rulers lived under constant pressure. They governed a kingdom, managed diplomacy, resolved disputes among nobles, and carried the expectations of an entire dynasty. Their moods shifted with political tensions, personal frustrations, and the endless demands placed upon them. Affection, in such circumstances, rarely remained steady. A woman who held the king's interest one season might simply become familiar the next. New faces appeared at court regularly. Daughters of noble families arrived to serve the queen. Visitors from other courts brought their own companions. Every arrival introduced the possibility of change, and the Tudor court understood change very well. In many ways, the position of a mistress resembled standing on a narrow platform surrounded by moving water. The surface beneath her might feel stable for a while, yet the currents around her were always shifting. A careless remark could create enemies. A misunderstood gesture could start rumors. Even success itself could attract attention from those who preferred someone else in that position. Because the mistress's greatest strength, her closeness to the king, was also the reason others watched her so carefully. Some women attempted to secure their position through generosity. They formed friendships with influential courtiers or offered favors that might create loyalty. Others tried to remain quiet and discreet, hoping that modest behavior would prevent resentment. Neither approach guaranteed safety. The court valued novelty more than stability. What seemed charming at first could become predictable later. Familiarity, once comfortable, sometimes turned into boredom, and boredom, in royal courts, often invited replacement. The process rarely happened dramatically. There were no declarations announcing that a mistress had lost favour. Instead, small changes appeared. The king spoke with someone else more often. Invitations shifted. Conversations shortened. Eventually, the difference became impossible to ignore. For the woman who once stood closest to the centre of attention, the realization could arrive slowly and painfully. What had once felt secure revealed itself to be temporary all along. From the outside, the Tudor court continued to look elegant and composed. Music played during banquets. Courtiers bowed with careful grace. Nothing in the ceremonies suggested instability. Yet beneath those polished rituals, personal relationships could change with quiet speed. And for the king's companions, the greatest danger was not scandal or accusation. It was simply the moment when attention moved elsewhere. The position of a Tudor mistress depended entirely on affection that could change without warning. A woman who seemed powerful one season could discover how fragile that influence truly was. And in a court where attention constantly shifted, someone was always waiting patiently for that moment of weakness. Life inside the Tudor court rarely allowed open confrontation, especially among women whose influence depended entirely on reputation. A mistress could not simply accuse another woman of ambition or betrayal. She could not demand justice in a courtroom, nor challenge a rival in a dramatic display of anger. The rules of the court were designed to preserve order and dignity, and public scandal threatened both. Because of this, rivalry among the king's companions rarely appeared in obvious ways. At first glance, the court seemed calm. Women exchanged polite greetings. They attended banquets together, walked through palace gardens, and stood beside one another during ceremonies where every gesture followed tradition. Their voices remained soft, their smiles carefully measured. Yet beneath that polished surface, a different reality unfolded. Competition existed, but it moved through quiet strategies rather than loud conflict. The women who navigated this world understood that open hostility would damage them as much as their rivals. A mistress who appeared jealous or aggressive risked looking unstable in the eyes of the king and the court. And instability was dangerous. A king surrounded by political tension rarely trusted people who appeared emotionally reckless. Courtiers valued composure. Calm behavior suggested intelligence and control, qualities admired in a royal environment where every decision could carry consequences. So rivalry had to be disguised. A woman might listen carefully during conversations, noting which names were mentioned with admiration and which were spoken with hesitation. She might repeat certain remarks in a slightly altered tone, allowing doubt to spread without appearing responsible for it. The words themselves often sounded harmless. A small observation, a thoughtful question, a remark spoken as if it were simple curiosity. Yet within the crowded corridors of the Tudor court, these quiet statements could travel surprisingly far. Servants repeated them while carrying trays through galleries. Ladies-in-waiting discussed them while arranging gowns and jewellery. Before long, the remark belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. Direct accusations were rarely necessary. Another common strategy involved patience. A rival did not need to attack openly if she believed the other woman might eventually damage her own reputation. Court life was exhausting and unpredictable. Misunderstandings happened easily. A careless comment, a poorly chosen ally, or a moment of visible frustration could create the impression of weakness. Those who waited carefully could use such moments to their advantage. Sometimes rivalry unfolded through subtle comparisons rather than criticism. A woman might behave in ways that quietly highlighted her own virtues. She appeared calm, where another seemed emotional. She behaved modestly, where others seemed proud. The contrast itself did the work. Observers at court loved concluding, Courtiers often believed they were skilled judges of character, even when their evidence consisted of nothing more than brief encounters and whispered stories. This tendency made indirect rivalry surprisingly effective. If two women stood near the king during a gathering, every movement might be interpreted. One might speak less and listen more, allowing others to describe her as thoughtful. The other might laugh too loudly, and within hours, someone might describe her as careless. Neither woman needed to say a word about the other. The court itself became the judge. Modern life offers an easy comparison. Imagine a workplace where two people compete for the same promotion, yet neither is allowed to criticize the other openly. Instead, they must rely on reputation, timing, and quiet influence. The Tudor court functioned similarly, though the stakes could feel far greater. Because a mistress's position depended entirely on favour, the loss of reputation could remove her from the centre of court life almost instantly. And once that distance appeared, restoring influence became extremely difficult. This was why careful strategy mattered more than bold confrontation. Women who survived longest in this environment rarely fought dramatic battles. They moved slowly, choosing their moments carefully and allowing circumstances to unfold in ways that appeared natural. Observers might see nothing more than polite interactions and elegant ceremonies. But beneath that calm exterior, calculations never truly stopped. Rivalry existed everywhere in the Tudor court. It simply wore the disguise of politeness. Rivalry in the Tudor court could never appear as open conflict, even when the stakes were deeply personal. Women competing for influence learned to rely on patience, reputation, and carefully chosen words instead of confrontation. In a world where every whisper carried weight, even the smallest remark could begin a quiet downfall. The Tudor court rarely displayed its conflicts openly. Visitors walking through the halls of the palace would have seen elegance, ceremony, and the steady rhythm of courtly life. Musicians played during dinners, servants moved quietly between tables, and noble women spoke with voices gentle enough to match the soft glow of candlelight. Nothing about the scene suggested warfare, yet within those same rooms, rivalries could be as determined as any battlefield struggle. The difference was that no swords were drawn, and no one raised their voice. Instead, conflict moved through the small details of daily interaction. A smile could conceal more than anger ever revealed. Women at court understood very well that visible hostility could destroy their reputation. The Tudor world valued restraint. A lady who appeared jealous, bitter, or openly aggressive risked becoming an object of suspicion herself. A king surrounded by political intrigue rarely trusted those who seemed unable to control their emotions. Because of this, composure became a shield. A woman could stand beside her rival during a banquet, speak with perfect politeness, and even laugh softly at a shared remark. Observers might interpret the moment as friendship or simple courtesy. In reality, both women might understand that their rivalry had already begun. The court was a place where appearances mattered almost as much as truth. Clothing was chosen carefully. Words were selected with caution. Even expressions carried meaning. A raised eyebrow, a slightly delayed greeting, or the tone used in a single sentence could quietly signal disapproval. These signals rarely escaped notice. Courtiers watched one another constantly. Conversations were remembered long after they ended. A remark that seemed harmless in the moment could be repeated hours later in a completely different context. Within this atmosphere, conflict required subtlety. One woman might greet another warmly while allowing a faint hint of doubt to slip into a conversation about loyalty or character. The words themselves sounded polite, yet their implication lingered long after the exchange ended. Such remarks worked precisely because they did not sound like accusations. If challenged, the speaker could easily deny any harmful intention. She had only been curious. She might say, she had merely repeated something she had heard. In a court built on observation and rumour, That explanation often proved enough. Eyes carried their own language as well. A glance exchanged between two ladies across a crowded chamber might suggest alliance or suspicion without a single word being spoken. Those who noticed such glances sometimes interpreted them more dramatically than the participants intended. Silence often encouraged imagination. Modern life offers a familiar comparison. In many workplaces today, disagreements rarely erupt into shouting matches across offices. Instead, competition unfolds through tone, reputation, and the careful management of relationships. The Tudor court functioned in much the same way, though the consequences could reach far beyond professional disappointment, because reputation in the royal court determined far more than social comfort. It influenced marriages, alliances, and political opportunities. For a mistress whose position already lacked legal protection, reputation could become the only barrier between security and sudden isolation. That was why outward calm remained essential. A woman who appeared serene during tense encounters signaled confidence. She suggested that whatever rumors existed around her held little truth. Meanwhile, a rival who reacted with visible frustration might seem unstable in comparison. The court often believed what it could see. This made emotional discipline one of the most valuable skills a woman could possess in Tudor society. Maintaining a pleasant expression during difficult moments required patience and self-control. It also required the ability to separate private feelings from public behavior. Not everyone managed this balance successfully. Those who did not sometimes revealed their anxieties in small ways. A sharper tone than intended. A moment of irritation that observers interpreted as arrogance. Once noticed, such reactions could circulate through the court's endless conversations. Soon, the reaction itself became the story. Meanwhile, the woman who remained composed gained a quiet advantage. Her calm behavior reinforced the impression that she had nothing to fear. Even those uncertain about the rivalry might begin to assume she stood on stronger ground. In this way, the Tudor court turned ordinary gestures into instruments of influence. No battles were announced. No one declared victory. Yet the struggle continued beneath the surface of daily life, hidden behind courtesy and elegant manners. A smile at court did not always mean kindness. Sometimes it simply meant the war had already begun. Conflict in the Tudor court rarely appeared as anger or confrontation. Women competing for influence learned to hide their intentions behind courtesy and calm expressions. Somewhere behind those careful smiles, the quiet struggle for power was already unfolding. In the Tudor court, information moved faster than official messages and often carried far more influence. Letters sealed with wax might take days to travel between towns. But a rumor spoken quietly in a palace corridor could circle the court before the evening candles were lit. For those who understood this reality, controlling information became the most valuable weapon available. Women competing for influence learned quickly that knowledge itself could shape the balance of power. A mistress who understood what people were saying behind closed doors rarely appeared surprised by sudden changes in the court's mood. She might hear about a new visitor long before the arrival was announced. She might learn that certain nobles had begun to speak favorably about another woman. Such knowledge allowed her to prepare. The Tudor court depended heavily on servants. Hundreds of people worked quietly behind the visible life of the palace. They carried letters, poured wine, arranged clothing, and moved between rooms that most courtiers rarely entered. In doing so, they witnessed almost everything. Servants noticed who visited certain chambers late in the evening. They heard fragments of conversations while opening doors or collecting empty dishes. They watched the expressions of courtiers leaving private meetings. Few of them possessed political power. Yet their knowledge of daily events was often more detailed than that of noble families. For a woman navigating court life, earning the trust of these observers could be invaluable. This trust did not always require bribery or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it came through simple kindness. A polite word spoken to a maid, a small gift offered during a festival, or the habit of remembering someone's name could create loyalty. Loyalty, in turn, sometimes encouraged quiet conversation. A servant might mention that a particular noble had visited the king earlier that day. Another might repeat a remark overheard while arranging chairs in a chamber where courtiers believed themselves alone. Each piece of information seemed small, yet when gathered together, these details formed a clearer picture of the court's shifting alliances. Rumours travelled through the palace constantly. The long stone corridors carried voices easily, and conversations rarely remained private for long. Even the architecture of Tudor buildings contributed to the spread of information. Footsteps echoed. Doors creaked. Servants moved between rooms with practiced speed. Within this environment, controlling rumours mattered almost as much as hearing them. A clever woman understood that once a rumour escaped into the corridors, it became nearly impossible to retrieve. The story changed slightly each time it was repeated, gathering new details and interpretations along the way. But rumours could also be guided. A carefully chosen remark placed in the right conversation could influence how people interpreted later events. If a woman quietly suggested that a rival behaved recklessly or spoke without thinking, that impression might linger. Later, when the rival made even a small mistake, observers remembered the earlier remark. The mistake seemed to confirm what they already believed. In this way, stories could take shape long before the truth fully emerged. Modern communication offers an easy comparison. A rumor shared on social media today can spread across thousands of people before anyone verifies its accuracy. By the time facts appear, the original impression has already settled in many minds. The Tudor court functioned in a remarkably similar way, though the conversations happened face to face rather than through screens. A woman who understood this dynamic rarely waited passively for events to unfold. Instead, she helped shape the narrative before it formed completely. If a rival's behavior risked attracting criticism, a quiet remark placed at the right moment might frame that behavior in an unfavorable light. Observers then interpreted future actions through that lens. This method required patience and precision. An accusation spoken too boldly could backfire. The speaker might appear jealous or vindictive, damaging her own reputation. Successful manipulation of information depended on subtlety. The best remarks sounded almost accidental. A comment delivered with mild curiosity. A question was asked as if seeking clarification. These approaches allowed rumours to spread naturally without obvious direction. Those who listened later rarely remembered where the idea had first appeared. In the Tudor court, where perception shaped influence, this ability to guide conversation quietly could determine who gained favour and who gradually lost it. Because once a story settled into the court's collective imagination, reversing it became extremely difficult. A reputation built through whispers could stand longer than evidence. For women, whose influence depended on fragile favour, mastering the flow of information became the first and most essential strategy. In the Tudor court, influence often depended less on truth than on the stories people believed. Women competing for favour learned that controlling information could shape how every action was interpreted. Somewhere within those stone corridors, a single, carefully placed rumour was already beginning its quiet journey. Reputation in the Tudor court functioned like fragile glass. It appeared solid while untouched, yet even a small crack could spread quietly across the surface. For women whose influence depended entirely on the king's favour, reputation often meant the difference between attention and disappearance. Because of this, one of the most subtle strategies in court, rivalry involved something far more dangerous than open insult. It involved doubt. Direct accusations rarely worked in a place built on ceremony and restraint. A woman who openly attacked another risked appearing bitter or unstable. Such behaviour could damage her own standing as much as her rivals. Instead, doubt had to be planted carefully. A remark did not need to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It only needed to raise a question that lingered in the mind of the listener. Once, curiosity began to grow. The court itself often supplied the rest of the story. The Tudor court had a remarkable appetite for speculation. People gathered in corridors, private chambers, and garden walks where conversation flowed easily. Names appeared in these discussions with surprising frequency. Someone might mention that a certain lady had once spent time in the household of a noble family known for scandal. Another person might remember hearing a rumor about her earlier friendships. None of these details necessarily meant anything on their own. Yet when spoken together, they created an atmosphere of uncertainty. A woman skilled in this form of rivalry rarely delivered statements that sounded like accusations. Instead, she spoke in tones of mild concern or curiosity. Her questions sounded thoughtful rather than hostile. Had anyone noticed how closely a certain lady spoke with a particular ambassador? Was it unusual that she seemed to know so much about certain political matters? The questions themselves remained harmless, but the suggestion beneath them could travel far. Once the idea of questionable loyalty entered the conversation, it began to influence how others interpreted future events. An innocent conversation with a foreign visitor might suddenly appear suspicious. A private letter might become the subject of speculation. The court often believed what it expected to see. This strategy worked particularly well because loyalty held enormous importance in Tudor politics. The kingdom faced constant threats from foreign rivals and internal conspiracies. Kings relied heavily on the trustworthiness of those around them. A whisper suggesting that someone might not be entirely loyal carried serious weight. Even if the rumor remained vague, the mere possibility of disloyalty could alter how a person was viewed. A rival did not need to prove anything. She only needed to create a situation where others began to question what they once assumed. The past offered another fertile ground for suspicion. Every person arriving at court carried a history that few others fully understood. They had grown up in different households, formed friendships with various families, and participated in social circles that outsiders might interpret in unexpected ways. By drawing attention to these distant connections, a rival could introduce doubt without stating any clear accusation. Perhaps someone remembered that the woman's family had once supported a political faction that later lost favor. Perhaps she had relatives who remained friendly with controversial figures. None of this necessarily meant wrongdoing. Yet within the watchful environment of the Tudor court, such details could become unsettling. People preferred certainty, especially when the king's safety and reputation were involved. When certainty disappeared, suspicion quietly took its place. The most effective form of doubt, however, occurred when the king himself began to wonder. A mistress hoping to weaken her rival rarely confronted the king directly with accusations. That approach risked appearing manipulative. Instead, she might allow small observations to appear naturally during conversation. Perhaps she mentioned hearing an unusual remark earlier in the day. Perhaps she repeated a rumor only to dismiss it gently, suggesting that it was probably untrue. Ironically, this dismissal often made the story more intriguing. Human curiosity tends to focus on what remains unexplained. If the king sensed that something about a person's past or behavior seemed uncertain, his mind might return to the thought later. Once that process began, the rival had already achieved part of her goal. Suspicion did not need evidence to grow stronger. It simply needed time. Modern life offers many examples of the same phenomenon. A rumor about someone's character, even when vague, can influence how others interpret every future action. A neutral remark suddenly seems suspicious. A friendly conversation begins to look like a hidden intention. Perception slowly replaces fact. The Tudor court operated under the same fragile dynamic. In a place where appearances carried enormous importance, the smallest uncertainty could become dangerous. A woman who succeeded in planting that uncertainty rarely needed to do anything further. The court itself would continue the work. In the Tudor court, destroying a rival's reputation rarely required direct accusation. Carefully placed, questions could transform ordinary behavior into something that seemed suspicious. Once doubt reached the king's mind, even the smallest gesture could begin to look like evidence. Reputation in the Tudor court did not exist only in private conversations. It also lived in the public moments where courtiers gathered. watched one another, and quietly judged what they saw. Banquets, ceremonies, and afternoon walks through palace gardens were not merely social occasions. There were stages where reputation could strengthen or slowly begin to weaken. For women competing for influence, these gatherings offered opportunities that rarely appeared in more private settings. Every movement at court attracted attention. The way a woman greeted others, the tone of her voice, even the timing of her arrival at an event could shape how observers interpreted her character. These details might seem small to an outsider, yet in the careful atmosphere of Tudor society, they carried surprising weight. A mistress who understood this environment learned to watch her rivals closely. Patience often mattered more than bold action. Most people make occasional mistakes in public life. A careless remark spoken a little too loudly, a moment of visible irritation, or an awkward exchange with a powerful courtier could leave a faint mark on someone's reputation. Such moments rarely destroyed a reputation immediately, but they could be used. The most effective rivalries did not attempt to invent scandals from nothing. Instead, they waited for genuine imperfections and then quietly ensured that others noticed them. A woman might appear beside her rival during a gathering at exactly the moment the rival seemed unsettled or distracted. She would remain calm, attentive, and composed, while the other struggled to recover from the awkward situation. Observers rarely missed such contrasts. The Tudor court possessed a strong fascination with manners. Grace, composure, and self-control were considered signs of intelligence and dignity. When two women behaved differently in the same situation, the comparison quickly became part of courtly conversation. One seemed confident, the other appeared uncertain. One spoke carefully, the other seemed careless. The details did not need explanation. The audience often provided its own conclusions. Social events created particularly useful moments for such comparisons. Banquets, dance, and celebrations brought together dozens of observers who watched one another carefully. In these crowded rooms, impressions could form quickly and travel through conversation even faster. A rival might choose to display generosity or kindness at the same gathering, where another woman appeared distant or impatient. The contrast itself became the message. No accusation was spoken aloud, yet the story quietly formed in the minds of those watching. Sometimes a rival did not even need to act directly. She simply allowed attention to remain focused on the other woman's mistake. Instead of changing the subject or softening the moment, she allowed silence to settle long enough for others to notice the tension. Silence could be remarkably persuasive. In an environment already filled with curiosity, people often remembered uncomfortable moments long after they had forgotten the ordinary conversations surrounding them. Once remembered, these moments began to grow. A remark that sounded slightly rude during a dinner might be described later as arrogance. A moment of confusion during a ceremony might become evidence of incompetence. Each retelling added small adjustments that slowly changed the meaning of the event. This process resembled how modern audiences sometimes react to public figures today. A brief mistake captured on camera can circulate widely, transforming a single awkward moment into a lasting impression about someone's character. The Tudor court functioned through a similar mechanism, though the stories travelled through voices rather than screens. What mattered most was not the mistake itself, but the interpretation that followed. A woman who appeared calm, gracious, and attentive during public gatherings quietly strengthened her reputation. If a rival happened to appear less controlled during the same events, the comparison could influence how both were viewed in the future. Over time, these repeated impressions formed a larger narrative. One woman seemed reliable and composed. The other seemed unpredictable. Once that narrative took hold, every new event appeared to confirm it. Even a small mistake could become symbolic of deeper flaws. Observers rarely realized how easily these narratives were shaped. They believed they were simply reporting what they had seen. In reality, their interpretation had often been influenced long before the event occurred. This was why public moments mattered so much in Tudor rivalries. A woman did not need to defeat her rival openly. She only needed to ensure that others began to see the rival in a less flattering light. Once that perception settled into the court's memory, it often remained there far longer than the original moment. Because in the Tudor court, reputation did not collapse all at once. It faded gradually, shaped by countless small observations repeated again and again. Public gatherings in the Tudor court were more than celebrations. They were stages where reputation quietly shifted. A single moment of composure beside a rival's mistake could influence how the entire court judged them both. Over time, even the smallest error could grow into a symbol that changed how one woman was remembered. Honour, in the Tudor court, was often spoken of as if it were solid and permanent. Nobles discussed family reputation with great seriousness. Sermons praised virtue and warned against moral failure. Public speeches celebrated the dignity and discipline expected of respectable women. Yet in practice, honour proved far more fragile than those speeches suggested. A woman's reputation could shift with surprising speed. What had once been admiration might quietly transform into suspicion. A court that praised grace and modesty could just as easily begin whispering about impropriety. The danger did not usually come from clear evidence. It came from interpretation. The Tudor court watched women closely. Their movements, their clothing, and their conversations were constantly observed. A woman who laughed too freely might be described as careless. One who spoke confidently might be considered ambitious. Neither description required proof. In a society that valued moral restraint, even small deviations from expected behavior could attract attention. And attention, once focused on a person, often invited speculation. A rumor rarely began as a full story. More often, it started as a question. Someone might mention that a lady had been seen speaking privately with a particular courtier. Another person might recall seeing her walking through the palace gardens at an unusual hour. None of these details necessarily meant anything. But once they entered conversation, they rarely disappeared. The Tudor court had an extraordinary ability to transform small observations into elaborate conclusions. Each person who repeated the story added a slight interpretation. By the time the rumour had travelled through several gatherings, it often sounded far more serious than the original moment had ever suggested. For women whose lives depended on reputation, this process could be devastating. A man accused of questionable behaviour might defend himself through political alliances or public explanation. A woman rarely had that opportunity. Her defence depended almost entirely on how others chose to interpret her character. And once doubt appeared, restoring trust could become nearly impossible. This fragility made reputation one of the most powerful weapons in the silent rivalries of the Tudor court. A rival did not need to destroy another woman physically. She only needed to create an atmosphere where others began to see that woman differently. If observers started to suspect moral weakness, even ordinary actions could appear suspicious. A greeting that seemed friendly yesterday might appear flirtatious tomorrow. A quiet conversation might be interpreted as secrecy. The change happened not in the action itself, but in how it was perceived. The king's court relied heavily on these perceptions. Advisors, en noble, and attendants all formed opinions based on what they believed they understood about the people around them. Once a reputation shifted, that opinion influenced how every new event was judged. A woman who had once been considered virtuous might suddenly find her behavior examined with suspicion. Even a glance in the wrong direction could become a story. This constant scrutiny forced many women to live with extraordinary caution. They monitored their gestures, moderated their speech, and avoided situations that might invite misunderstanding. Yet caution did not guarantee safety. Because rumors did not always rely on visible behavior, sometimes they appeared through suggestion alone. A rival might quietly remark that certain stories had begun circulating, though she claimed not to believe them herself. Ironically, this denial often ensured that the stories spread even further. Modern audiences sometimes witness similar patterns when public figures become subjects of gossip. A single photograph, a misunderstood comment, or an incomplete story can circulate widely, shaping public perception before any facts emerge. The Tudor court operated under the same principle, though its conversations occurred in halls rather than on screens. For women whose influence depended on reputation, this environment made life precarious. Their power might appear significant while they held the king's attention, yet it rested on a foundation easily disturbed by rumour. A rival who understood this vulnerability did not need violence. She only needed patience and a careful understanding of how people talked. Once the court began repeating certain stories, events often moved without any visible effort from the person who had first suggested them. Reputation weakened quietly. Trust faded gradually, and the woman at the centre of the rumour might never fully understand how the change had begun. Because in the Tudor court, the most dangerous battles rarely involved weapons. They involved perception. In the Tudor court, a woman's reputation could fracture long before anyone realised it had been damaged. A single rumour or misunderstood glance could begin changing how the court interpreted her every action. From that moment, victory no longer required a sword at all. Power in the Tudor court did not always come from land, titles, or official authority. Sometimes it appeared in a quieter form, hidden inside conversations that took place when the formal business of the day had ended. When council meetings were finished, and courtiers withdrew from crowded chambers, the king often found himself surrounded by a much smaller circle of companions. In those quieter moments, emotion could influence decisions as strongly as politics. Kings were expected to appear confident and decisive. They ruled kingdoms, resolved disputes among nobles, and carried the responsibility of protecting their realm from enemies abroad. Publicly, they presented themselves as figures of control and certainty. Privately, however, the pressure of that responsibility could become overwhelming. A Tudor king lived in constant awareness that his choices affected thousands of lives. Wars depended on his judgment. Alliances rose or collapsed according to his trust. Even the stability of the dynasty rested on his ability to manage threats and ambitions within the court. Few people around him could speak freely about such burdens. Many courtiers approached the king with requests, ambition, or political arguments. Their conversations often revolved around strategy, power, and advantage. Even when their advice proved useful, it rarely addressed the emotional strain carried by a ruler. This created a subtle opportunity. A woman who understood the king's private concerns could present herself not simply as a companion, but as a listener. She might speak less about politics and more about the feelings hidden beneath the decisions he made each day. Listening itself became a form of influence. When a person feels understood, trust often follows naturally. A king who sensed that someone truly recognized his frustrations might begin to rely on that presence more often. Conversations that began as moments of comfort could gradually shape how he viewed the people around him. This influence rarely appeared dramatic. A mistress might express quiet sympathy when the king spoke about disloyal nobles or difficult negotiations. She might suggest that certain individuals had treated him unfairly, reinforcing feelings he already carried. The suggestion did not need to sound forceful. It only needed to confirm what he suspected. Human emotions respond strongly to affirmation. When someone validates our doubts or disappointments, those feelings often grow stronger. The Tudor court offered many situations where such emotional reinforcement could quietly alter a ruler's perspective. Another powerful emotion involved betrayal. Royal courts were filled with shifting loyalties. Alliances formed and dissolved with surprising speed. Advisors who appeared devoted one year might support a rival faction the next. This instability made kings naturally sensitive to signs of disloyalty. A mistress who hinted that certain courtiers did not respect the king as they claimed could amplify those suspicions. Again, the suggestion did not need to be direct. Perhaps she made a remark that sounded dismissive. Perhaps she recalled a conversation where someone seemed reluctant to support the king's plans. Each detail sounded minor when considered alone. Together, they formed a pattern. Over time, the king might begin to see particular individuals through the lens of that pattern. Ordinary disagreements could start to resemble evidence of betrayal. In contrast, the woman who provided comfort during these conversations appeared increasingly trustworthy. Her role expanded beyond companionship. She became the person who seemed to understand the king's frustrations more clearly than anyone else. In a court filled with ambition and calculation, this sense of emotional loyalty could become extremely persuasive. Modern observers might compare this dynamic to situations in which a leader relies heavily on a small group of confidants. When someone consistently listens, sympathizes, and offers explanations for difficult events, their influence naturally increases. The Tudor court provided ideal conditions for such influence to develop. Kings spent long periods surrounded by people whose motivations were rarely transparent. When one voice sounded sincere and supportive, it stood out against the background of political maneuvering. Yet this intimacy also carried strategic value. A mistress who shaped how the king interpreted his own experiences could indirectly shape how he viewed others at court. Advisors might find their recommendations questioned. Rivals might appear less trustworthy than before. The transformation rarely looked like manipulation. It felt like understanding. And that made it far more effective. Because once the king believed that one person truly recognized his struggles, he might begin to measure everyone else against that example. Those who failed to match it could slowly lose their confidence. In the Tudor court, influence over a ruler's emotions could quietly become influence over his decisions. Influence in the Tudor court often began with something as simple as listening. A woman who seemed to understand the king's fears and frustrations could gain the trust others struggled to earn. In that fragile trust, the quiet reshaping of his suspicions and loyalties could slowly take root. The Tudor court often appeared to revolve around the king alone. Yet influence within those halls rarely belonged to a single person. Beneath the formal ceremonies and polished speeches existed a network of relationships that quietly determined how power moved through the palace. For women, competing for influence, survival rarely depended on personal charm alone. Allies mattered. A mistress who attempted to navigate the court entirely on her own often discovered how quickly attention could turn against her. Rival factions formed easily in an environment where ambition and opportunity lived side by side. Without support from others, even the most favored companion could become vulnerable. Because influence at court rarely operated in isolation, women of noble families carried their own connections into the palace. They arrived not only as individuals, but as representatives of households that possessed land, titles, and long histories within the kingdom. These family networks extended far beyond the palace walls. A woman who understood this system recognized that relationships among noble women could become powerful resources. Friendships between ladies often appeared casual to outside observers. They met during ceremonies, shared conversations in galleries, and attended religious services together. Yet beneath these polite interactions, alliances were sometimes formed with quiet intention. A mistress might seek the friendship of a respected noblewoman whose family held strong influence with certain courtiers. Such friendships could bring subtle advantages. If rumors about the mistress began circulating, her ally might gently dismiss them during conversation. If a rival attempted to damage her reputation, the ally's support could soften the impact. In a court where perception mattered deeply, this kind of backing offered valuable protection. Family support provided another layer of strength. A mistress connected to a powerful household rarely stood alone in the court's political landscape. Her relatives might hold positions in regional administration or maintain friendships with influential nobles. Even if they remained physically distant from the palace, their reputation could influence how others treated her. Courtiers often hesitated to attack someone whose family commanded respect. The presence of a strong family network suggested that any insult might provoke consequences beyond the palace walls. This possibility encouraged caution among those who might otherwise attempt to undermine her. Yet alliances in the Tudor court rarely remained fixed forever. Circumstances changed quickly. Political tensions shifted. Individuals who once appeared trustworthy might begin supporting different factions. Because of this uncertainty, some alliances existed only temporarily. Two women who normally competed for the king's attention might discover that they shared a common rival. In such situations, cooperation could become surprisingly practical. Their partnership might remain discreet. They did not need to appear as close companions in public. Instead, they might exchange small pieces of information, offer quiet assistance, or avoid actions that would benefit their shared opponent. Once the rival's position weakened, the temporary alliance might fade. The Tudor court understood such arrangements without requiring them to be explained openly. Observers often sensed when two individuals had decided not to interfere with each other for a time. This kind of cooperation reflected the practical nature of court life. In an environment shaped by shifting loyalties, long-term trust was rare. What mattered more was recognizing when interests aligned and using those moments effectively. A mistress who understood how to form alliances carefully could extend her influence far beyond the king's private chambers. Through her allies, she gained access to conversations happening elsewhere in the palace. She heard about decisions before they were announced and learned how others interpreted events unfolding around them. Information moved through these networks quietly. The Tudor court resembled a complex web rather than a simple hierarchy. Every connection carried potential influence. A remark shared between two allies might reach the ears of a noble family. A concern expressed privately could travel through several relationships before returning to the king in a completely different form. Women who mastered these networks rarely appeared powerful at first glance. They spoke softly, behaved with courtesy, and avoided dramatic displays of ambition. Yet behind their calm presence existed a structure of relationships that supported them. Rivals who underestimated this structure sometimes discovered too late that they had challenged not one person, but an entire web of quiet alliances. Because in the Tudor court, influence often depended less on individual strength than on the number of voices willing to support it. Influence in the Tudor court rarely belonged to a single person standing alone. Women who survived longest understood how to surround themselves with quiet alliances and supportive families. Within those hidden networks, the balance between rivals could begin shifting long before anyone recognized the change. Life inside the Tudor court moved with a rhythm that rewarded patience. Visitors arrived. Alliances shifted. Rumors circulated through corridors, and attention drifted from one person to another. Nothing remained perfectly stable for long. Those who tried to force quick victories often discovered that the court had little sympathy for impatience. In such an environment, time itself could become a powerful strategy. Women competing for influence gradually learned that not every rivalry required immediate action. In fact, acting too quickly often exposes better intentions left hidden. A careless accusation or a visible display of jealousy could damage the accuser as much as the rival. Because reputation at court depended heavily on composure. A woman who appeared calm and disciplined signaled that she trusted her own position. By contrast, someone who reacted with visible urgency might appear insecure or threatened. Observers noticed these differences immediately. For this reason, patience often served as a form of quiet strength. A mistress who believed her rival might eventually damage her own reputation sometimes chose simply to wait. Court life placed constant pressure on everyone who lived within it. The endless ceremonies, conversations, and expectations created countless opportunities for mistakes. No one remained perfectly composed forever. A rival who seemed confident during one season might later reveal impatience, frustration, or poor judgment. Perhaps she responded too sharply to a remark. Perhaps she formed an alliance that others considered unwise. Sometimes the mistake appeared as nothing more than exhaustion, because maintaining influence at court required enormous energy. A woman favored by the king faced constant scrutiny. Courtiers watched her behavior, speculated about her intentions, and repeated stories about her actions. Every gathering became a performance where composure had to be maintained carefully. Over time, that performance could become tiring. A rival who waited patiently understood that fatigue often produced small errors. A moment of irritation, a careless word, or a visible sign of frustration might emerge after weeks of pressure. Alone, the mistake might appear harmless, but within the watchful environment of the Tudor court, observers rarely ignored such moments. This was why some women resisted the temptation to retaliate immediately when confronted with rumors or criticism. Instead of answering every attack, they allowed the situation to unfold. Silence sometimes proved more effective than response. A woman who refused to engage in open conflict often appeared confident and dignified. The absence of reaction encouraged observers to question the motives of the person who had begun the dispute. Why had she spoken so harshly? Why did she seem so determined to create tension? Gradually, attention shifted. The rival who had attempted to provoke conflict might begin to look unreasonable, while the woman who remained composed appeared stable and trustworthy. Time quietly altered the interpretation of events. Patience also allowed new information to appear. Court politics rarely remained hidden forever. Alliances changed. Conversations leaked into corridors, and servants carried fragments of stories between rooms. A woman who waited carefully could gather these fragments before making any decisive move. Acting with incomplete knowledge often creates unnecessary risk. If a rival possessed stronger allies than expected, an attack could backfire. If the king still trusted her deeply, accusations might appear unjust. But with time, clearer patterns often emerged. Observers noticed which courtiers visited certain chambers repeatedly. They noticed who spoke in hushed tones with ambassadors or who appeared nervous during particular conversations. Each detail helped reveal where true loyalties rested. This slow accumulation of information transformed patience into preparation. Modern observers might recognize a similar strategy in long political campaigns or corporate rivalries. Leaders who appear inactive for long periods are sometimes gathering knowledge, building support, and waiting for a moment when action will produce greater impact. The Tudor court operated under the same quiet logic. A woman who waited carefully did not remain passive. She observed. She listened. She allowed events to reveal weaknesses that might otherwise remain hidden. When the moment finally arrived, her response could appear almost effortless. Observers might believe that circumstances had changed naturally. They rarely noticed the weeks or months of silent patience that had prepared the outcome. Meanwhile, the rival, who had once seemed confident, might gradually lose energy. Constant suspicion, repeated rumors, and the pressure of defending her reputation could slowly erode her composure. Fatigue made caution more difficult. Small mistakes appeared more frequently, and each mistake strengthened the impression that her influence had begun to fade. In this way, time itself became a quiet ally. A woman who mastered the rhythm of the Tudor court did not always rush toward confrontation. She understood that influence could grow stronger through restraint. The court rewarded those who allowed events to reveal themselves, because in a world filled with ambition and rivalry, patience often proved more dangerous than aggression. Rivalry in the Tudor court did not always require immediate action. Women who understood the rhythm of court life often allowed time to expose their rivals' weaknesses. Through patience and quiet observation, even the strongest position could slowly begin to unravel. The Tudor court rarely recorded its quietest conflicts. Official chronicles described wars, marriages, and treaties. They preserved the names of kings, generals, and ambassadors. Yet the slow struggles unfolding within the palace itself often left little trace in those records. Some of the most determined rivalries happened without any announcement at all. From the outside, the court looked orderly and calm. Courtiers attended ceremonies with measured grace. Ladies exchanged polite greetings while moving through corridors lined with tapestries. Musicians played softly during banquets, where conversation remained pleasant and controlled. Visitors who witnessed these scenes might easily believe that life at court moved in predictable harmony. The reality was far more complicated. Competition existed constantly beneath that calm surface. Not every rivalry erupted into scandal or public humiliation. Many unfolded gradually, shaped by countless small decisions made over weeks, months, or even years. These were conflicts that rarely attracted attention at first. Two women might begin their rivalry with nothing more than a difference in favor. One stood slightly closer to the king during gatherings. One received invitations to private conversations more frequently than the other. At the beginning, the difference seemed small. Yet small differences mattered in the Tudor court. Attention functioned like light. It illuminated some figures while leaving others in shadow. Those standing in the brightest light often appeared influential and admired. Those slightly farther away became less visible, even if their position had once seemed secure, because attention rarely remained fixed forever. A woman who lost a portion of the king's attention did not immediately disappear from court life. She still attended ceremonies, still walked through the gardens, still spoke with friends during gatherings. But subtle changes began to appear. Her presence might attract fewer conversations than before. Courtiers who once approached her eagerly might hesitate for a moment before speaking. Invitations to private discussions might arrive less frequently. None of these changes seemed dramatic on their own. Together, they slowly altered how the court perceived her importance. This gradual shift made such rivalries difficult to recognize clearly. No declaration announced that one woman had gained influence while another had lost it. Observers simply noticed that the balance of attention had changed, and attention in the Tudor court influenced nearly everything. Allies followed the direction of favor. Courtiers preferred to associate with those whose influence appeared strongest. A woman whose presence seemed less central might find her circle of supporters quietly shrinking. The process resembled the slow movement of shadows during the day. At first, the change remained almost invisible. Only those watching carefully noticed how the light had shifted. Hours later, the difference became unmistakable. Though no single moment marked the transition, rivalries often unfolded through this same quiet progression. A mistress who understood the nature of court life rarely expected immediate victory. Instead, she focused on shaping perceptions slowly. She allowed rumors to circulate. She waited for small mistakes to accumulate in the public memory. Each detail contributed to a larger narrative. Perhaps observers began describing one woman as composed and thoughtful. Perhaps another gradually gained the reputation of being unpredictable or careless. The descriptions did not appear all at once. They emerged through repeated conversations where each speaker believed they were simply describing what they had observed. Modern audiences might recognize a similar process in public life today. A figure once admired can slowly lose popularity through a series of small controversies or misunderstandings. No single event causes the decline, yet the overall impression gradually changes. By the time the shift becomes obvious, the outcome already feels inevitable. The Tudor court functioned in the same quiet manner. A woman whose influence weakened rarely received a clear explanation. She might simply notice that the king's attention rested elsewhere. Conversations around her sounded slightly different. The warmth she once felt in certain rooms seemed to fade. Meanwhile, the rival, who had benefited from this change, rarely appeared triumphant. An open celebration would have been inappropriate. The court valued restraint, and visible ambition often attracted suspicion. Instead, the woman who gained influence continued her behavior calmly, as though nothing significant had occurred. Observers might believe that circumstances had simply evolved naturally. But beneath the polite surface of court life, the outcome often reflected months of subtle maneuvering. A rivalry that began quietly could end in the same way. One woman remained close to the center of attention. The other gradually stepped further away from it, sometimes without fully realizing when the distance had begun. Because in the Tudor court, defeat rarely arrived with dramatic announcements. It arrived through absence. A person who once stood near the brightest light slowly found herself standing outside its reach, and by the time anyone noticed the change clearly, the struggle had already ended. The rivalries of the Tudor court rarely produced dramatic victories or visible battles. Influence shifted slowly through months of quiet observation and subtle changes in attention. In the end, one woman simply remained in the light, while another faded beyond it. Influence in the Tudor court rarely disappeared all at once. It faded gradually, usually through a quiet process that most observers did not recognize immediately. A woman might still walk through the same corridors, attend the same ceremonies, and greet the same courtiers she had always known. Yet something subtle had changed. Conversations no longer formed around her as easily as before. In the Tudor court, relationships created invisible networks that determined who held influence and who did not. These networks consisted of friendships, alliances between families, shared loyalties, and countless small interactions repeated over time. A woman who remained well connected within this network could maintain her presence even when circumstances shifted around her. But if those connections began to weaken, her position could slowly become unstable. One of the most effective strategies in quiet court rivalry involved isolating a rival from these networks of support. The process rarely appeared aggressive. Instead, it unfolded through subtle adjustments in how people interacted with her. At first, the change might seem insignificant. A noblewoman who once greeted her warmly might appear distracted during conversation. A courtier who previously sought her opinion might now choose to speak with someone else first. Invitations that once arrived regularly might begin appearing less often. Each small difference looked accidental. Together, they altered the atmosphere surrounding her. Because the Tudor court paid close attention to patterns of social behavior, people observed who spoke with whom during gatherings, who stood together during ceremonies, and who walked side by side through the palace gardens. These observations influenced how others behaved. If several respected courtiers appeared less enthusiastic about a certain woman's presence, others often followed their example. Few individuals wanted to risk associating themselves too closely with someone whose influence seemed uncertain. Gradually, the network surrounding her began to thin. Social gatherings offered particularly clear examples of this shift. Banquets, celebrations, and evening entertainments were central to life at court. These events provided opportunities for conversation, alliance building, and quiet negotiation. They were also places where social status became visible. A woman whose influence remained strong found herself surrounded by conversation. People greeted her with interest, asked for her opinion, and remained eager to share news or stories. But someone whose network had begun weakening might notice subtle differences. Conversations paused more quickly when she approached. Groups that once welcomed her presence might politely excuse themselves. The energy of the room seemed to flow around her rather than toward her. She was still present, yet she was no longer central. The absence of invitations carried a similar meaning. A woman who once attended nearly every gathering might suddenly find that certain dinners or excursions took place without her knowledge. Explanations were usually polite. Perhaps the event had been small. Perhaps space had been limited. Yet these explanations repeated themselves often enough to create a pattern. Observers at court quickly noticed such patterns. Once a person appeared less frequently at important gatherings, her reputation began shifting quietly. People assumed that the king's favor might be changing. Even if no official announcement existed, perception influenced behavior once again. Those who sensed that a woman's influence was fading often directed their attention elsewhere. Courtiers preferred to associate with individuals whose positions seemed secure. In an environment shaped by ambition, few wished to invest time in alliances that might soon become useless. This gradual withdrawal of attention could feel surprisingly isolating. A woman who once moved confidently through crowded rooms might begin noticing moments of awkward silence. Conversations stopped more abruptly. Faces turned away more quickly than before. The court had not rejected her openly. It had simply moved on. Modern social life sometimes reflects similar patterns. In professional circles, a person whose influence appears to decline may slowly lose invitations to meetings or discussions that once included them. Colleagues rarely explain the change directly. Instead, attention shifts toward those perceived as more influential. The Tudor court operated according to the same quiet dynamic. A rival who understood this process did not need a dramatic confrontation. She only needed to encourage subtle changes in how others perceived the woman she wished to weaken. If enough observers began to believe that the rival's influence had faded, the network surrounding her would gradually dissolve. Each person acted cautiously, believing they were responding to changing circumstances. Yet those circumstances had often been shaped deliberately. In time, the isolated woman might find herself standing at the edge of gatherings, where she once stood at the center. Conversations continued around her, yet few seemed directed toward her presence. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No accusation had been announced. But influence rarely survives without connection. And in the Tudor court, losing connection often meant losing everything that once gave a person importance. Influence in the Tudor court depended heavily on the invisible networks connecting people. When those networks quietly weakened, a woman could find herself drifting toward the edges of court life. Soon, the rooms where she once stood at the center began to feel strangely distant. In the Tudor court, appearances often carried as much power as actions. People believed what they could see, and what they saw most often shaped their understanding of character. Because of this, reputation did not rely only on what someone truly did. It depended heavily on how that person appeared in the eyes of others. For women navigating the fragile world of court influence, this reality offered an unusual form of protection. A carefully maintained image of virtue could function almost like armor. The Tudor court admired certain qualities in noble women: modesty, composure, kindness, and restraint were praised repeatedly in sermons and social expectations. A woman who displayed these traits in public seemed trustworthy and respectable. Such impressions mattered greatly. When observers believed a woman behaved with dignity and discipline, they often defended her automatically against criticism. Rumors that might harm another person sometimes lose their strength when directed toward someone widely perceived as virtuous. Because the accusation did not seem to match the image people already held, women who understood this dynamic learned to cultivate an appearance of calm morality. They spoke gently during conversations, avoided loud disputes, and displayed patience even in uncomfortable situations. These gestures appeared natural, yet they also served a strategic purpose. A woman who behaved with visible kindness made it difficult for rivals to portray her as manipulative or dangerous. Even if whispers circulated through the corridors, many listeners hesitated to believe them. Their own observations seemed to contradict the rumors. Public settings offered ideal opportunities to reinforce this image. During ceremonies or gatherings, a woman might demonstrate generosity towards servants, courtesy toward other ladies, and quiet respect toward the queen. Each moment strengthened the impression of virtue. The Tudor court valued consistency in behavior. A person who repeatedly appeared calm and gracious gradually became associated with those qualities in the minds of observers. Once such an image settled into public perception, it created a powerful shield. Accusations directed at that woman often reflected more negatively on the accuser than on the target. If someone criticized a figure widely admired for her composure, listeners sometimes questioned the motives behind the criticism. Why had the accuser spoken so harshly? What personal resentment might explain the remark? Gradually, suspicion shifted direction. In this way, a reputation for virtue could transform into a subtle weapon. The woman who appeared innocent did not need to defend herself aggressively. The court itself often responded on her behalf. Observers protected the image they believed. Meanwhile, the rival who attempted to attack that reputation sometimes appeared bitter or jealous. Her criticism seemed excessive compared with the calm behavior of the woman she accused. The contrast worked quietly but effectively. Modern audiences occasionally witness similar patterns in public life today. When a widely respected figure faces accusations, supporters often respond immediately by defending that person's character. Their previous impression of the individual influences how they interpret the criticism. The Tudor court operated under a similar psychology. A woman who maintained the appearance of modest virtue encouraged others to believe that accusations against her must be exaggerated or malicious. Even if uncertainty remained, doubt often settled around the accuser rather than the accused. This dynamic created a reversal. Instead of damaging the woman whose reputation had been carefully cultivated, the attack exposed the rival's hostility. Listeners might interpret her criticism as evidence of ambition or envy. Over time, that interpretation could weaken the rival's own position. Meanwhile, the woman who maintained her calm demeanor appeared even more admirable for refusing to respond aggressively. Her restraint reinforced the perception that she possessed dignity and patience. The Tudor court rewarded such restraint. Public behavior shaped memory. Courtiers remembered the lady who spoke gently, who avoided unnecessary conflict, and who treated others with visible courtesy. These memories traveled through conversation and observation. Soon, the court's collective image of her became difficult to challenge. Of course, the image itself did not necessarily reveal the entire truth about her intentions. A woman who appeared modest and kind could still understand the strategic value of that reputation. Her calm presence might conceal careful calculation, but the success of the strategy did not depend on revealing those calculations. It depended on how convincingly the image of virtue was presented and how consistently it was maintained. In a court where rumor traveled quickly and reputations could collapse overnight, appearing innocent could become one of the strongest defenses available. A rival who underestimated this defense sometimes discovered that her accusations had produced the opposite effect. Instead of weakening her opponent, they strengthened the image of virtue she had tried to destroy. And once the court accepted that image as truth, challenging it became extremely difficult, because in the Tudor court, perception often mattered more than proof. In the Tudor court, a reputation for quiet virtue could shield a woman more effectively than open confrontation. Carefully maintained innocence encouraged the court to doubt anyone who attempted to accuse her. Soon, the criticism meant to weaken her began to erode the credibility of the rival who had spoken it. Religion surrounded nearly every aspect of life in Tudor England. Churches stood at the centre of towns. Sermons echoed through stone halls each week, and moral language shaped how people understood right and wrong. The court itself was not separate from this atmosphere. Kings ruled with political authority, yet their legitimacy also rested on the belief that they governed within a moral and religious order. Because of this, questions of virtue carried enormous weight. In the Tudor court, reputation did not depend only on loyalty to the king. It also depended on how closely a person appeared to follow the moral expectations promoted by the church. Those expectations shaped how courtiers judged one another, even when their own behavior did not always match the ideals they praised. For women, competing for influence, these expectations created another subtle strategy. A rival could be weakened by associating her with moral doubt. Direct accusations of immorality rarely appeared openly in polite conversation. They were too dangerous and too dramatic for a court that valued restraint. Instead, the suggestion often appeared through careful contrast. One woman might quietly emphasize her own devotion. She attended religious services regularly, spoke respectfully about spiritual matters, and behaved with visible modesty in public gatherings. Observers noticed these details. The Tudor court paid close attention to outward signs of piety. A woman who seemed sincere in her religious conduct gained a reputation for discipline and moral strength. That reputation could quietly shape how others interpreted the behavior of those around her. Once the impression of virtue became established, comparison began to work naturally. If another woman behaved more freely, spoke boldly, or appeared less concerned with religious ceremony, those differences could attract quiet criticism. The criticism did not need to be spoken directly. It emerged through suggestion. Someone might remark that a particular lady seemed unusually fond of late gatherings or lively conversation. Another person might wonder aloud whether such behavior reflected the dignity expected from a woman close to the king. The remark sounded mild, yet the implication lingered. Within a society strongly influenced by religious language, even small hints of moral weakness could become powerful. The Tudor court believed that personal character reflected inner discipline. If someone appeared careless about virtue, observers sometimes questioned her judgment in other matters as well. This interpretation made moral reputation extremely valuable. A woman who carefully aligned herself with the visible standards of piety could encourage others to view her as trustworthy and stable. At the same time, the contrast with a rival's behavior might gradually create suspicion around that rival's character. The church itself rarely participated directly in such rivalries. Priests and bishops did not normally involve themselves in the private competitions of courtly life. However, their teachings shaped the language through which people judged one another. When courtiers spoke about morality, they often echoed ideas heard during sermons. Concepts such as virtue, temptation, discipline, and repentance formed the framework through which behavior was interpreted. A rival who seemed careless about these values could appear spiritually unreliable, and spiritual unreliability carried social consequences. Courtiers often believed that moral weakness could lead to poor judgment or dangerous influence. A woman suspected of encouraging indulgence or excess might appear unsuitable as a close companion to the king, even without a formal accusation. Such impressions could weaken her position. The process worked quietly. A mistress who wished to damage her rival's standing rarely needed to invent stories. She simply allowed comparisons to grow stronger. Her own careful behavior reinforced the impression of discipline, while the rival's ordinary actions gradually seemed more questionable. Modern society occasionally reveals similar dynamics. Public figures who present themselves as morally responsible often gain strong support from audiences who value those qualities. Meanwhile, rivals perceived as less disciplined may face heavier criticism, even when their actions differ only slightly. The Tudor court responded to these perceptions in much the same way. Religion provided a language that people already trusted. When discussions about morality entered courtly conversation, listeners tended to treat them seriously. Few wished to appear indifferent to virtue. This gave moral reputation unusual influence. A rival associated with spiritual doubt might find that conversations about her gradually changed tone. Courtiers became more cautious when speaking with her. Invitations to religious events or quiet gatherings might become less frequent. The change did not require formal judgment. It unfolded through perception. Meanwhile, the woman who maintained the image of moral discipline continued to strengthen her reputation. Observers believed they were simply recognizing her character, unaware that the contrast itself had quietly shaped their conclusions. In this way, religion and morality became tools within the silent rivalries of the Tudor court. No confrontation was necessary. Only the careful encouragement of comparisons allowed others to reach their own conclusions. In the Tudor court, moral reputation could shape influence as strongly as political loyalty. A woman who appeared disciplined and devout encouraged observers to question the character of those around her. Gradually, the rival linked to moral doubt began to lose the quiet trust that once protected her place at court. Violence rarely solved rivalries inside the Tudor court. The palace did not resemble a battlefield, and open acts of harm would have caused a scandal powerful enough to threaten everyone involved. Yet destruction still occurred there, though it took a very different form. Reputation could be destroyed far more quietly than a life. For women living within the delicate structure of royal favour, reputation was often the only real protection they possessed. Titles, wealth, and family connections could offer some stability, but a woman whose influence depended on the king's attention relied above all on trust. Once that trust weakened, everything else began to loosen. The Tudor court believed deeply in character. People spoke frequently about loyalty, en vertu, and dignity. These values shaped how courtiers judged one another. A woman who appeared honorable could maintain respect even when she faced criticism. But a woman suspected of moral weakness faced a very different reaction. Suspicion did not need proof to become powerful. The court rarely demanded formal evidence before forming opinions. Instead, people interpreted behavior through the stories they already believed. If a rumor suggested that a woman had behaved dishonorably, observers began to reinterpret her past actions through that lens. A friendly conversation might look flirtatious. A private meeting might appear secretive. Even silence might seem like guilt. Gradually, the interpretation changed more than the events themselves. This transformation often happened slowly. A rival who wished to weaken another woman's position rarely attempted dramatic accusations. Instead, she allowed doubts to circulate gently through conversation. Questions replaced statements. Someone might mention that a certain lady seemed unusually comfortable speaking with powerful men. Another might recall hearing that her family had once been associated with controversial figures. None of these remarks clearly accused her of wrongdoing, but together they created a shadow around her reputation. The Tudor court paid careful attention to shadows. Once a woman's honor became uncertain, the consequences spread outward. Courtiers who once greeted her warmly might begin behaving with cautious distance. Conversations grew shorter. Invitations became less frequent. People feared association with controversy. Because reputation in the Tudor court functioned collectively, a scandal attached to one person could easily affect those who appeared too closely connected with her. By stepping away quietly, courtiers protected themselves from potential consequences. This withdrawal deepened the damage. A woman who sensed others avoiding her often struggled to defend herself effectively. Every attempt to explain the rumors risked repeating them. Every denial could appear desperate, and desperation rarely improved reputation. In this way, the destruction of honor required no public confrontation. It unfolded through silence and distance rather than accusation. Modern observers sometimes witness similar patterns when public figures face rumors or controversy. Supporters begin to hesitate. Allies grow quiet. Even those who doubt the accusation may withdraw temporarily to protect their own reputation. The Tudor court followed the same instinct. Once, trust began to weaken. Influence weakened with it. A woman who once spoke confidently among powerful courtiers might suddenly find herself standing at the edge of conversations where she had previously been welcomed. The change could feel confusing at first. Nothing had been officially announced. No authority had declared her reputation damaged. Yet the court's behavior revealed the truth. Influence depended on the belief that a person could be trusted. Without that belief, proximity to power became uncomfortable for everyone involved. Even the king might begin to notice the shift. If advisors spoke more cautiously around a particular woman, or if trusted companions quietly expressed concern about her character, the king might reconsider his own impressions. Suspicion rarely required certainty. It only required the possibility that something might be wrong. For a mistress whose influence rested entirely on personal favor, that possibility could be devastating. The rival who encouraged those doubts rarely needed to celebrate openly. Victory in the Tudor court rarely appeared as triumph. It appeared as an absence. One woman remained surrounded by conversation and attention. The other gradually disappeared from the center of court life. Because in the delicate world of Tudor reputation, destroying honor achieved what violence never needed to attempt. It removed a rival without leaving visible wounds. In the Tudor court, reputation served as the fragile foundation beneath a woman's influence. When trust began to collapse, even the strongest position could dissolve with surprising speed. Often, the downfall happened so quietly that no one could point to the exact moment it began. Mistakes in the Tudor court rarely happened by accident alone. Life inside the palace was filled with pressure, observation, and quiet rivalry. Under such conditions, even disciplined individuals sometimes reacted in ways they later regretted. For women, competing for influence These moments of weakness could become decisive. A rival who wished to weaken another woman's position did not always need to invent rumors or gather evidence. Sometimes, it was enough to create a situation where the rival revealed her own vulnerability. Emotion could become the most dangerous trap. The Tudor court valued composure. Nobles admired restraint and calm behavior, especially among women whose reputation depended on dignity. A lady who appeared measured and self-controlled earned respect. By contrast, someone who reacted with visible anger or frustration risked appearing unstable. Observers watched these reactions closely. Because court life rarely offered privacy, even brief exchanges could attract attention. Conversations happened in crowded chambers, along corridors where servants passed constantly, and in gardens where others walked nearby. This meant that every emotional reaction could become public. A clever rival understood this environment and used it carefully. Instead of confronting her opponent directly, she might speak in ways designed to provoke irritation. The remark sounded harmless on the surface, a compliment delivered with subtle irony, a question that hinted at doubt, a reminder of a rumor that had supposedly been forgotten. Each statement appeared polite enough to avoid criticism, yet together they created tension that slowly built within the listener. If the rival maintained patience, the strategy might fail. But patience at court required enormous discipline. The constant pressure of gossip, competition, and scrutiny made emotional control difficult. A woman who already felt insecure about her position might react sharply to even minor provocations. The moment of reaction mattered more than the provocation itself, because observers rarely remembered the earlier comments that had created the tension. What they remembered clearly was the visible outburst that followed. A raised voice during a gathering, a harsh remark spoken in anger, a gesture that appeared disrespectful. In the Tudor court, such reactions quickly became stories. People repeated them in conversations later that evening. Servants carried fragments of the event through corridors as they moved between rooms. By morning, the court might already possess several versions of the same moment. Each version emphasized the lack of control. A rival who remained calm during the exchange appeared composed and dignified. The contrast made the emotional reaction of the other woman look even more dramatic. The court interpreted what it saw. Composure suggested stability. Anger suggested weakness. This interpretation became especially significant when the king himself witnessed the exchange. Kings valued loyalty and discipline within their courts. They depended on the judgment of those around them, and often grew cautious of individuals who appeared unpredictable. A woman who lost control in the king's presence risked damaging his confidence in her. Not because anger alone was unforgivable, but because emotional instability raised questions about reliability. If a woman reacted strongly to small provocations, courtiers wondered how she might behave during more serious disagreements. A rival who carefully arranged such moments understood their importance. Sometimes the situation developed naturally. Two women might find themselves attending the same gathering or speaking with the same courtier. In other cases, circumstances were arranged more deliberately. A conversation might be steered toward a sensitive topic. A remark might be repeated where the rival could hear it clearly. The intention remained subtle. The goal was not open confrontation, but a moment where the rival revealed more emotion than the court considered appropriate. Modern observers occasionally see similar dynamics in public life today. Political debates, televised interviews, or press conferences sometimes become less about the content of the discussion and more about how participants react under pressure. A single moment of visible frustration can reshape public perception. The Tudor court operated under the same psychological principle. Once, a woman displayed uncontrolled emotion. The memory of that moment often overshadowed everything that came before it. Courtiers described the incident repeatedly, sometimes exaggerating the details with each retelling. Soon, the reaction itself defined her reputation. Meanwhile, the rival who had remained calm gained a quiet advantage. Her composure suggested maturity and confidence. Observers concluded that she possessed a stronger character. No accusation had been necessary. The court believed it had witnessed the truth with its own eyes. In this way, provoking a mistake could accomplish what rumor alone might struggle to achieve. The rival damaged her own reputation in full view of the people whose opinions mattered most. And once that impression settled into memory, it rarely disappeared. Because in the Tudor court, influence depended not only on what people believed, but on what they believed they had seen. In the Tudor court, a single moment of visible anger could outweigh years of careful reputation. Rivals who remained calm during such moments appeared dignified while their opponents seemed unstable. Soon, the court remembered only the outburst, not the quiet provocations that had created it. The Tudor court rarely remained politically stable for long. Alliances formed, dissolved, and reformed again as new concerns emerged within the kingdom. Noble families supported different strategies. Advisors offered competing counsel, and foreign affairs constantly reshaped the priorities of the crown. Within this shifting environment, loyalty could appear surprisingly flexible. A courtier who seemed influential one year might lose favor the next. Advisors who once spoke confidently beside the king might quietly withdraw from public life when political winds changed direction. Women connected to the court understood these changes just as clearly. Although they did not hold official positions in government, they lived close enough to the center of power to observe the subtle signals of political transformation. Conversations grew quieter when certain names were mentioned. Courtiers began appearing beside new allies during gatherings. Attention moved gradually from one group to another. For a mistress seeking to strengthen her position, these movements offered an opportunity. Political factions in the Tudor court often competed for influence over the king's decisions. One group might advocate cautious diplomacy, while another urged stronger confrontation with foreign rivals. Some favored religious reform, while others preferred stability in traditional practice. These disagreements rarely disappeared completely. Instead, they shifted in strength. A woman who recognized the moment when influence began drifting from one faction to another could adjust her alliances accordingly. She might cultivate friendships with courtiers whose voices were becoming stronger within the king's circle. The change did not need to appear dramatic. A polite conversation during a gathering, a quiet expression of agreement with a newly favored policy, a gesture of support for a courtier whose influence seemed to be rising. Each small action signaled awareness of the political climate. Observers at court noticed such signals quickly. Those who aligned themselves with the stronger faction often appeared more confident and secure. Their proximity to emerging influence suggested good judgment and adaptability. Meanwhile, those who remained connected to the weakening faction began to appear uncertain. This perception created a strategic advantage. A rival associated with a declining political group could suddenly seem less reliable. Even if she personally had little involvement in political debates, her connections might place her reputation within the shadow of that faction's decline. In the Tudor court, association mattered deeply. Courtiers believed that loyalty revealed character. If someone appeared connected to individuals losing the king's confidence, observers sometimes assumed that person shared their questionable judgment. A mistress who recognized this shift could quietly encourage the connection in conversation. She might mention that her rival had long been friendly with a particular advisor, now facing criticism. She might express mild surprise that the rival continued to associate with figures whose influence seemed uncertain. The remarks sounded thoughtful rather than hostile, yet they gently guided the interpretation of the rival's relationships. Soon, the rival's presence began to appear politically inconvenient. Courtiers who wished to remain close to the king's changing priorities hesitated before associating too closely with someone connected to the losing side of a political struggle. Distance developed naturally. This transformation did not require accusations of wrongdoing. It simply relied on the perception that the rival's connections no longer matched the direction in which power was moving. In many ways, the process resembled modern political environments, where public figures become vulnerable when associated with unpopular policies or declining leaders. The shift in perception happens quickly once the balance of power changes. The Tudor court responded with similar sensitivity. Those who wished to remain influential adapted quickly. They aligned themselves with rising voices and gradually separated themselves from individuals whose influence appeared to be fading. A rival who failed to adjust could become a quiet liability. The king himself might begin to see the connection as inconvenient. If advisors warned him about the risks of associating with certain factions, he might prefer companions whose relationships appeared safer and more reliable. Thus, political change created social consequences. The woman who recognized the shift early could present herself as aligned with stability and good judgment. Her rival, still connected to the declining faction, appeared increasingly uncertain. The difference did not need to be explained directly. Observers at court believed they were simply responding to political reality. Yet behind the scenes, careful observation had transformed that reality into a strategic advantage. Because in the Tudor court, influence rarely belonged to those who resisted change. It belonged to those who recognized when the direction of power had already begun to move. Political change in the Tudor court quietly reshaped the reputation of everyone connected to it. A woman who aligned herself with rising influence appeared wise, while a rival tied to fading factions seemed increasingly risky. Gradually, the court began treating that rival not as an ally, but as a complication best avoided. The Tudor court did not always remove people through formal judgment. Trials existed, and some figures were publicly condemned. Yet many disappearances within the palace happened without ceremony or explanation. A person who once moved confidently through crowded halls might simply stop appearing there. No announcement explained the change. Visitors arriving at court often noticed the absence only after some time had passed. At first, the missing figure seemed merely delayed. Perhaps she had travelled to visit relatives. Perhaps she had remained in her chambers due to illness. The explanations sounded reasonable, yet days turned into weeks, and the familiar presence never returned. Such disappearances rarely shocked those who lived within the palace. Courtiers understood that influence at court depended on favour, reputation, and perception. When those fragile elements shifted, a person could lose access to the centre of royal life with surprising speed. The removal rarely involved a dramatic accusation. In fact, the absence of accusation made the process smoother. A public charge would require evidence, witnesses, and a formal procedure. It might provoke sympathy for the accused or invite uncomfortable questions. Quiet removal avoided these complications. Instead, the change often began with distance. A woman who once attended regular gatherings might suddenly receive fewer invitations. She might notice that certain private meetings no longer included her. Conversations that once welcomed her presence now seemed to close more quickly when she approached. At first, the difference seemed subtle. The Tudor court excelled at subtlety. Servants delivered messages explaining that the king's schedule had changed. Courtiers politely suggested that certain gatherings had been arranged for a smaller group. Each explanation sounded harmless when heard alone. Together, they formed a pattern. Gradually, the woman found herself spending more time away from the crowded chambers where court life unfolded. She might remain in her assigned rooms, while others attended celebrations or discussions. The court continued its daily rhythm without interruption. Eventually, the distance became official in an indirect way. A letter might arrive, suggesting that the woman would be more comfortable returning to a family estate for a time. Sometimes the explanation involved health, rest, or the need for privacy. The tone remained courteous, but the meaning was unmistakable. Leaving the court rarely felt like a choice. Even when the suggestion appeared polite, everyone understood that refusal would create uncomfortable consequences. A woman who resisted such advice risked appearing uncooperative or desperate. Most accepted the arrangement quietly. Observers outside the palace might hear vague explanations about travel or personal matters, without official charges or a dramatic scandal. Few people questioned the story closely. Silence protected the court from unnecessary attention. Inside the palace, however, courtiers recognized what had happened. They understood that the woman's influence had weakened until her presence became inconvenient. Rather than confront the situation openly, the court allowed her to disappear gradually. Modern institutions sometimes follow similar patterns. In professional environments today, individuals whose influence declines may quietly resign, to transfer to distant positions, or take extended leave. Official statements rarely describe the true reasons behind the departure. The Tudor court followed a comparable logic. Maintaining order required avoiding visible conflict whenever possible. Quiet departures preserved the appearance of harmony. They also prevented the kind of scandal that might embarrass powerful figures. For the woman leaving court, the experience could feel strangely unreal. One day, she had stood near the center of conversation and attention. Next, she found herself preparing to travel away from the palace, surrounded by explanations that sounded polite but distant. The corridors where she once walked confidently continued to echo with music and conversation. Only her absence marked the change. Meanwhile, the rival, who had benefited from this shift, rarely acknowledged it openly. Celebrating the departure would appear cruel and inappropriate. Instead, she continued her routine as though nothing unusual had occurred. The court respected such restraint. Observers might privately recognize that a rivalry had ended. Yet no one spoke of victory or defeat. The palace simply adjusted to the new arrangement. A familiar figure had vanished from its daily life, and the palace continued forward as though she had never been central to it at all. Because in the Tudor court, the most effective removal did not require judgment or punishment. It required silence. The Tudor court had a way of erasing people without ever announcing their removal. A woman who once stood near the center of power could quietly find herself outside the palace walls. In time, the court behaved as though she had never belonged there at all. Victory inside the Tudor court rarely looked like victory. No banners were raised in celebration. No announcement declared that one rival had defeated another. The palace did not pause to recognize that a struggle had ended. Instead, life within the court moved forward with the same calm rhythm it had followed the day before. Music continued to echo through the great halls. Servants carried trays through crowded corridors. Courtiers gathered in small circles to exchange news and speculation. Everything appeared unchanged. Yet those who observed the court closely could sense that something had shifted. A familiar figure no longer appeared among the ladies attending the Queen's chambers. Her voice was missing from the soft conversations that filled the palace corridors. Her laughter no longer joined the quiet amusement of evening gatherings. In her place, another woman stood a little closer to the center of attention. She did not appear triumphant. In fact, the opposite behavior was expected. A woman who had gained influence through the disappearance of a rival was careful to present herself with modesty and restraint. Any visible satisfaction might provoke suspicion or resentment among the court. Instead, she behaved with calm composure. Her expression remained gentle. Her words stayed measured and polite. She greeted others with the same quiet courtesy she had always displayed. To an outside observer, nothing seemed unusual. Yet her position had changed in ways that did not require explanation. When the king spoke during gatherings, his attention turned toward her more frequently. When decisions about court events were discussed, her presence became quietly expected. She had moved closer to influence without announcing the journey. The Tudor court valued this kind of restraint. An open celebration of victory would suggest ambition. An ambition in a woman could be interpreted as dangerous or manipulative. Maintaining the appearance of humility preserved the illusion that events had unfolded naturally, as though the court itself had simply rearranged its balance. Meanwhile, the woman who had lost the struggle was rarely left behind dramatic signs of defeat. Her departure from the palace often occurred quietly, explained through polite reasons that protected everyone involved. Visitors arriving weeks later might hear that she had returned to family lands for rest. Others might be told she had chosen to withdraw from court life for personal reflection. These explanations prevented uncomfortable questions. The court preferred stories that sounded orderly and dignified, even when rivalry had shaped the outcome. The official narrative described only peaceful transitions. This careful storytelling protected the reputation of everyone connected to the event. Courtiers understood the pattern. They knew that rivalries existed beneath the surface of palace life. They knew that influence shifted constantly among those who lived close to the king. Yet they also understood that acknowledging such conflicts openly would threaten the delicate stability of the court. So the palace preserved its calm appearance. If we compare this to modern institutions, the pattern feels surprisingly familiar. In many professional environments today, on promotions, resignations, and quiet transfers can signal the outcome of internal struggles that never appear in official announcements. The language remains neutral. The real story remains unspoken. The Tudor court practiced the same method centuries earlier. Appearances mattered more than explanation. Maintaining harmony in public mattered more than revealing the tensions that produced it. For the woman who had gained the advantage, this silence served an important purpose. It allowed her influence to grow without drawing attention to the process that created it. Courtiers gradually accepted her new position because nothing about the change appeared dramatic. The court simply adjusted around her. She might attend more private conversations with the king. She might receive invitations to gatherings where decisions were quietly shaped. Her presence became familiar in places where influence gathered. No one announced the transformation. It simply existed. Meanwhile, the palace continued its daily routine with impressive consistency. Banquets filled the great hall. Diplomats arrived from distant kingdoms. Musicians played during evening entertainments. Life within the Tudor court never paused to acknowledge the invisible struggles that shaped it. And perhaps that was the most effective strategy of all. When victory left, no trace of conflict. No one could easily challenge it. Rivalries in the Tudor court often ended without a visible moment of triumph. A rival departed quietly, while another woman stepped closer to influence with calm composure. The palace continued its elegant routine, leaving observers to wonder how such victories could happen without anyone ever naming them. Life inside the Tudor court demanded constant awareness. Every movement within the palace could be observed. Conversations carried further than expected through stone corridors. A careless remark spoken during a gathering might travel quietly across the court before the evening had ended. For those who lived close to the center of influence, this atmosphere never truly relaxed. Women who competed for attention, favor, and survival within the court often carried this pressure for years. Their position depended not only on the king's affection, but also on reputation, alliances, and perception among hundreds of watching courtiers. None of these factors remained stable for long. A compliment from the king might strengthen a woman's standing for 1 week. A rumor whispered among courtiers might weaken it the next. The balance between influence and vulnerability shifted constantly. Living within such uncertainty shaped the mind in subtle ways. A woman learned to measure every word before speaking. She studied the expressions of those around her, searching for signs of approval or suspicion. Even moments of ordinary conversation carried the possibility of hidden meaning. Silence often felt safer than honesty. Yet silence did not eliminate the pressure. It merely redirected it inward. Thoughts that could not be spoken aloud remained circulating in the mind, examined repeatedly for possible consequences. Over time, this habit changed the way many courtiers experienced daily life. Instead of enjoying gatherings, they analyzed them. Instead of trusting companions easily, they observed them. Each interaction carried the possibility of advantage or danger. Suspicion gradually became a routine response. A friendly gesture might conceal a hidden motive. A compliment might contain quiet irony. Even kindness sometimes appeared strategic rather than sincere. Within such an environment, trust became difficult to sustain. Women competing within this structure often formed alliances to strengthen their security. Yet even alliances required caution. A partner who seemed reliable today might decide tomorrow that a different connection offered greater advantage. Political shifts within the court could transform friendships into rivalries with surprising speed. For this reason, many women developed a habit of emotional restraint. They learned to hide disappointment when plans failed. They learned to conceal satisfaction when opportunities appeared. Their expressions remained controlled, their reactions carefully moderated. Observers might describe them as calm or composed. In reality, the composure often required constant effort. The pressure of maintaining such control over many years could shape personality itself. Some women became increasingly cautious, speaking less and revealing little of their private thoughts. Others adopted a confident public demeanor that protected them from appearing vulnerable. Both responses served the same purpose. They reduced the risk of exposing weakness. The Tudor court rewarded those who appeared steady and self-controlled. Emotional reactions could easily be interpreted as instability or ambition. Remaining composed under scrutiny suggested reliability. Yet the cost of this constant vigilance rarely appeared in official records. Modern observers sometimes imagine court life as glamorous or theatrical, filled with music, clothing, and ceremony. Those elements certainly existed. The palace hosted elaborate gatherings, elegant performances, and diplomatic receptions that impressed visitors from across Europe. Behind those scenes, however, lived a quieter reality. Many courtiers carried the tension of unspoken rivalry with them every day. They watched their surroundings carefully, aware that their reputation could change quickly. Even those who appeared secure understood how fragile their position could become. A single rumor might begin spreading through the court's network of servants and attendants. A political shift might suddenly weaken the allies who once provided protection. A misunderstanding with the king could transform a favored companion into a distant observer almost overnight. No one felt completely safe from these possibilities. This uncertainty created a shared psychological atmosphere within the palace. Courtiers learned to anticipate change even when life appeared calm. They adapted quickly when circumstances shifted, often suppressing personal feelings to maintain stability. Over time, this constant adjustment became second nature. A woman might wake each morning aware that her influence depended on maintaining balance between caution and opportunity. She measured every action against the invisible expectations surrounding her. Too much confidence could appear arrogant. Too much hesitation could appear weak. Finding the correct balance required attention and patience. Years spent navigating these pressures left lasting marks on those who experienced them. Even after leaving the court, many individuals carried habits of caution and observation into the rest of their lives. They had learned that power often operated quietly, and that survival within such systems required a steady mind. The silent rivalries of the Tudor court shaped not only reputations but also the minds of those who lived within them. Years of careful observation and restraint taught women to treat suspicion as a form of protection. Gradually, the court became a place where composure mattered as much as loyalty, and where trust itself grew difficult to recognize. Power in the Tudor court appeared to belong almost entirely to men. Kings issued commands, councils drafted policies, and noblemen negotiated alliances that shaped the future of the kingdom. Official authority carried seals, signatures, and titles that clearly defined who possessed the right to govern. Women rarely held such formal roles. The laws of the time placed political responsibility almost exclusively in male hands. Government offices were occupied by men. Legal authority rested with male judges, and inheritance systems ensured that most property moved through male lines. On paper, this structure seemed absolute, yet daily life within the court revealed a more complicated reality. Although women lacked official positions, they often lived closer to the king's private world than many powerful ministers. They attended gatherings where the atmosphere was informal rather than political. They spoke with the king during moments when he was not surrounded by advisors or diplomats. These quiet moments carried influence that official meetings sometimes lacked. The Tudor court depended not only on formal authority but also on personal relationships. Decisions did not emerge solely from written reports or council debates. They were also shaped by trust, sympathy, and familiarity. Women who lived within the king's circle understood this dynamic. A conversation shared during an evening gathering might soften the king's view toward a certain noble family. A gentle reminder of loyalty might encourage him to reconsider a harsh judgment. These influences did not appear in official records, yet they shaped the environment in which decisions were made. This kind of influence required subtlety. A woman could not openly instruct the king or claim responsibility for shaping policy. Doing so would violate the expectations of modesty and restraint placed upon women at court. Instead, influence moved through suggestion, conversation, and presence. The process rarely looked dramatic. It often resembled ordinary companionship. A woman might listen patiently while the king described his concerns. She might respond with empathy or curiosity rather than direct advice. Yet, these responses shaped how the king interpreted his own thoughts. Human beings naturally trust those who appear to understand them. When someone listens carefully and responds thoughtfully, their opinions begin to carry greater weight. Women within the Tudor court learned to use this psychological reality. They understood that influence did not always require formal authority. Sometimes it required only proximity and trust. Modern observers might describe this as soft power. Unlike military strength or legal authority, soft power operates through persuasion and perception. It encourages others to adopt certain views without issuing commands. The Tudor court provided many examples of this dynamic. A woman who earned the king's confidence could shape the atmosphere around him. Her reactions influenced how he interpreted the behavior of others. Her presence affected the emotional tone of discussions taking place within the palace. Even ministers who held official power recognized this influence. They understood that a favored companion might alter the king's mood before an important conversation. A suggestion spoken during a private moment might linger in his thoughts when he later met with advisors. Such influence remained invisible to most observers. Yet its consequences could be significant. For this reason, rivals within the court often competed not only for affection, but also for proximity. Being near the king meant participating in an environment where decisions began forming. Influence rarely appeared in written documents. It appeared in subtle changes of opinion, in the tone of conversation, and in the trust placed in certain voices over others. This reality reveals an important lesson about power within systems that appear strictly hierarchical. Formal authority may define who holds official responsibility, but influence often flows through personal relationships that remain outside those structures. Women within the Tudor court learned to navigate this space carefully. They understood that claiming power openly might provoke resistance or scandal. Instead, they cultivated influence through patience, observation, and emotional intelligence. Their methods rarely appeared in historical records, yet their presence shaped the environment in which political decisions developed. In many ways, this influence could be more effective than official authority. Commands might provoke opposition. Direct pressure might invite scrutiny. Soft influence, by contrast, moved quietly through trust and familiarity. It shaped outcomes without announcing its role. That is why historians studying court life often discover traces of influence rather than explicit statements of power. Letters, memoirs, and diplomatic reports hint at conversations that changed the direction of royal attention. These hints reveal a subtle network of persuasion operating beneath the official structure of government. For the women who navigated this system, the challenge lay in balancing visibility and discretion. They needed to remain close enough to influence events while avoiding the appearance of ambition that might provoke backlash. Success required careful judgment. Too much involvement might attract criticism. An insufficient presence might allow rivals to gain an advantage. Between these extremes existed a narrow space where influence could grow quietly. Women who mastered this balance discovered that power did not always require titles. Sometimes it required only the ability to shape others' perceptions. Women in the Tudor court lacked formal authority, yet they often shaped the environment in which power operated. Through proximity, trust, and subtle persuasion, their influence moved quietly through the king's private world. In such a system, the most effective power was not always the loudest or most visible. The Tudor court rarely revealed its true battles. Visitors arriving at the palace often saw elegance and ceremony. Velvet gowns moved slowly across polished floors. Musicians played gentle melodies, while courtiers exchanged polite conversation beneath painted ceilings. The atmosphere suggested stability and refinement. Yet beneath this calm appearance, a quieter form of conflict unfolded. Unlike the wars fought beyond the kingdom's borders, the struggles within the court rarely involved weapons. No armies were marching through corridors, and no commanders issuing orders across crowded halls. Instead, the competition moved through silence. Influence shifted through conversations that seemed ordinary. A rumor might begin with a casual remark during an evening gathering. A reputation might weaken through repeated suggestions that sounded more like concern than accusation. These moments rarely looked dangerous when viewed individually. Yet together, they could reshape a person's future within the court. The Tudor palace depended heavily on perception. Reputation functioned as a form of currency, determining who could approach the king freely and whose presence might cause hesitation. Courtiers studied these signals carefully. They watched where the king directed his attention. They noticed whose opinions seemed welcome and whose remarks received polite silence. They observed which individuals appeared regularly beside the king during gatherings and which gradually drifted toward the edges of the room. These observations guided behavior. Those seeking influence moved closer to emerging centers of attention. Those whose reputations weakened discovered that conversations around them grew shorter. Invitations arrived less frequently. Doors that once opened easily began to close. The transformation rarely happened in a single moment. It unfolded slowly enough that many observers struggled to identify its beginning. A rival might lose influence over weeks or months, while the palace continued its normal rhythm. No public declaration explained the change. In this environment, silence became a powerful tool. Open accusations risked scandal. Visible conflict might embarrass the king or provoke factions within the court. Quiet strategies avoided these complications. A woman seeking an advantage could allow suspicion to grow naturally. She might speak gently about concerns regarding another courtier's judgment. She might express surprise that certain actions had occurred. These remarks sounded thoughtful rather than hostile, yet they shaped how others interpreted events. Over time, the court's perception adjusted. The rival who once seemed secure began appearing uncertain. Small doubts accumulated until they formed a new understanding of her character. Once that shift occurred, influence rarely returned easily. The king himself depended on these subtle signals. Surrounded by advisors and courtiers competing for attention, he relied on reputation to decide whom he trusted most. Individuals whose reputations weakened gradually lost access to his confidence. Thus, the outcome of the rivalry often appeared peaceful. A woman who lost influence might withdraw from court life without formal accusation. Her departure could be explained by travel, illness, or family responsibilities. The palace preserved its appearance of harmony. Meanwhile, another woman stood quietly closer to the center of attention. She did not claim victory. In fact, claiming victory would have contradicted the careful silence that allowed influence to grow. Instead, she continued her role with calm composure, allowing the court to interpret the situation in its own way. Observers might sense that a rivalry had ended, yet no official explanation described the struggle. This pattern repeated throughout the history of the Tudor court. Rivalries began quietly, unfolded through reputation and perception, and ended with a disappearance rather than a declaration. The palace continued its routines as though nothing unusual had occurred. Looking back from the present, This form of conflict appears strangely familiar. Modern institutions often operate through similar dynamics. Influence rises and falls through reputation, alliances, and perception rather than confrontation. The Tudor court simply displayed these patterns with remarkable clarity. For those who lived within its walls, survival required patience and awareness. Words needed careful selection. Reactions needed careful control. Even silence required careful timing. Women who mastered this balance discovered that influence did not always belong to the loudest voice or the strongest authority. It belonged to those who understood how perception moved through a crowded room. They learned to shape those perceptions carefully, and in doing so, they practiced a form of power that rarely left visible traces. That is why the quiet struggles of the Tudor court remain difficult to reconstruct in detail. The strategies that shaped them rarely appeared in official documents. They existed in gestures, conversations, and the gradual shifts of reputation. History preserves only faint outlines of these movements. Yet those outlines reveal something important. Power does not always operate through noise or spectacle. Sometimes it moves most effectively through patience, observation, and restraint. Inside the Tudor court, silence could reshape an entire life. A rival might lose influence without hearing a single accusation. A woman might gain the king's trust without ever announcing her ambition. The palace continued its elegant routines, while these transformations unfolded quietly around it. In this sense, the court resembled a calm surface, hiding strong currents beneath. Visitors admired the beauty of the ceremony. Those who lived there understood the hidden movement beneath it. And perhaps that understanding explains why the palace seemed so composed even during its fiercest rivalries. Because the most effective weapon in the Tudor court was never the sword. It was silent. In the Tudor court, rivalries rarely ended with confrontation or visible victory. A woman who understood how reputation moved through quiet conversation could remove a rival without drawing attention to the struggle. And within those silent victories, the palace continued its graceful routine as though no battle had ever taken place. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through history together. Stories like these remind us that power often moves in ways that are difficult to see, even when we are standing very close to it. Now it is time to let the palace corridors grow quiet and allow the night to settle gently around you. Sleep well, and may your dreams drift peacefully through the silent halls of history.